And now Clive Palmer has warned the Chinese government won't back away from threats against Australia amid escalating trade tensions. The mining magnate suggests the government should consider imposing tariffs on Australian resources in a bid to counter China's bullying. Where do you see this Australia-China relationship going? Because the Chinese seem to be upset that we pushed very hard to get to the bottom of how the Wuhan virus actually originated, and it's pretty clear why we did that, because we want to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Well, the Chinese just want to win at all costs. It doesn't matter what the issue is. They want to dominate you and have you kowtow to them. That's their strategy. Doesn't matter what position you take, doesn't matter whether you're reasonable or unreasonable. They don't care. If it's not in China's interest, they're not interested. They believe Australia is the new China. The Chinese are mainly interested in control. That's how they look at the situation. And the ancient China, of course, believed that we were the barbarians and that they were the civilised people. That hasn't changed much within the cultural mentality. And of course, China is totally dependent on Australia for its iron ore and resources. If it didn't have access to that iron ore, certainly you'd find that the Chinese economy would collapse. They know that. And if the government really wanted to put a tariff on iron ore or to counter what they're doing to our barley and bullying our industries, that's all they have to do. They just have to say, whatever tariff you want on your iron ore is equivalent to what you're doing to our industry, to try to make a political point. And they'd be in line pretty quickly, and they'd respect that a lot more than they do. They see the Australian side sometimes as being weak. You know, I remember them recounting stories to me in the China Free Trade Agreement, laughing about how that they would have a particular position at the start of the day's negotiation, and as long as they didn't agree with the Australians until 4 o'clock, the public servants would all agree between 4 and 5 because they wanted to get home in time for dinner. So that was part of their strategy that they used to use in dealing with the Australian government and negotiating different issues. So the Chinese are about control. Of course, they want control of our resources in Western Australia. McGowan's got a former member of the Communist Party as his chief whip in the upper house. And McGowan's very close to China. And you see a lot of, I mean, I've heard stories of a lot of heads of state going up to China being offered a passbook with the Bank of China with $50 or $60 million in it and saying, well, it's available for you only through the Bank of China, that sort of thing. So the Chinese will protect their national interest. They will use anything at all, any activity, bribery, our courts, our agencies against us.
Well, speaking of China, the Victorian government has the Belt and Road Initiative, a deal down there. What do you make of Andrews?
Well, I think Andrews and McGowan are in the same mould. They are in the Stalinist communist mould of this totalitarian government. I mean, there's no reason why you'd extend the state of emergency for 18 months unless you wanted to establish that form of government. Of course, that's the same form of government that we have in China, where we don't have the rule of law or independent system. And, you know, the act that McGowan's passed against me is the government deciding that they will decide judicial outcomes, not the courts, and that they will direct people, and there'll be they've exempted themselves from the criminal law. I
wrote a piece the other day, Clive, about how we should look at abolishing the states, and I tell you what, I got a couple of hundred emails from people saying, absolutely, let's have a referendum. Do you think we're over-governed?
Yeah, we are. If you look at our population, the 3 levels of government and the breakup of powers, of course we are. What we need is to take a couple of regional areas and put them together as, like, say, North Queensland, Central Queensland and Southern Queensland. And that should be our regional type governments. And then we're consolidating a lot of our local governments, which are very fragmented and not financially viable.
You'd actually set up 3 different governments?
No, like 3 regional governments that eliminate local government, right?
Oh, right.
Okay,
yeah.
and you eliminate state government, right? And then you have a national government. That's what we should do if you're running a business. The amount of bureaucracy we've got, the number of public servants is just too much for the taxpayer to bear, right? And we're not getting the service, right? You think of all the shires there are in Queensland that are in a deficit, that don't have 1,000 people that they represent or something like that. It's just not the way to do it, especially now when you're online, you've got all these services. I mean, I would abolish Parliament House if I was Prime Minister and put everybody online. You don't need it, really. Yeah, 5,000 people working at Parliament House. It's just ridiculous. You know, all that travel, all those people, you just go online, do it with Zoom, and you could all lock your vote in, away you would go. They don't vote anyway, they just do what the 2 parties tell them to do. Nobody actually says anything. You know, when you go to Parliament, it's so funny. On the left-hand side, you've got a box down there next to the Speaker, which is made up of all Liberal staffers. They sit on the floor of the House of Representatives. On the right-hand side is another box made up of Labor people, and they hand over the questions they're allowed to ask and the speeches they're allowed to do. So I only got the chance to ask her questions every 2 weeks, but they'd get a real question.
And they'd have to...
They'd go, oh, no, not this. Like, I never forget when they had superannuation coming in and they wanted to, the retirement age, wanted to put that out to 70, right? And they're talking about when you get your super entitlement. So I got up and I said, well, look, I've got a good idea. Why don't we link the age of super entitlement to what we ever get in Parliament? And we link that to, if we're giving them 70, we get ours at 72. And the Labor Party said, don't go there, mate. Don't go there, mate. So I went outside and the press said, why did you ask that question? I said, well, I thought it'd be the easiest way to bring the date down for eligibility of superannuation to 39. Because you have self-interest, you see.
Yeah. Well, self-interest is the key for a lot of politics.
Well, that's what it's about. But it's not bad. Democracy works on self-interest too, that people vote what's good for them. What we have today is a mixture of people knowing what's good to them. People telling them that they're going to die of the virus. I mean, we lost last year around about, I think it was 750 people from influenza. This year we've lost 400 from COVID, less from influenza. But every year, 160,000 Australians die. That's a fact. That's a 1% mortality.
Do you think there's been an overreaction?
I think so, when the damages it's done with the women that have been beaten, and say probably some men may have been too, but they're the cases that ring me, when there's the suicides and the mothers and the families, because there's fly-in, fly-out workers in Western Australia that hasn't seen their wives and children for 6 months, that they find they just can't take it any longer, they commit suicide. Yeah, I think that's a very bad thing. That's a real thing. It's not as publicly popular because, as President Roosevelt said in 1933, we have nothing to fear but fear alone. And of course, that's what McGowan's doing in Western Australia. There's been zero interstate transmissions of the virus in Western Australia at all. And 3 months ago, he was saying we can't lock the state down. So this is all about winning an election.
And just finally, Clive, you believe in the justice system. You don't have any qualms in going to the courts. You spend a lot of time in the courts. Is that something that, I mean, are you a frustrated lawyer?
Well, the reality of it is, if you look at our size of businesses and what we're doing, the number of court cases we have is less than BHP, Rio, and other companies like that, just that it's me personally involved. But you've got no choice. When you had Queensland Nickel and all the suits we had there, we had to defend them. And ultimately we were successful. What we said was true. We hadn't done anything wrong. We'd done the opposite, right? I'd given $3 million, I think, to pay workers Christmas pay from my own pocket, right, for example, right?
Well, that was that famous Townsville night where you gave away all the cars and the holidays.
We gave away 1,500 holidays to our workers to go to Fiji with the whole family. We gave them 15 Mercedes-Benz when times were good, right? So that there wasn't any... We didn't make a lot of money out of Queensland Nickel. We're just trying to help Anna Bligh when she asked us, could someone save those jobs in 2008? But anyway, if people are going to sue you, you have to defend yourself, right? In this particular case, we've got it against the West Australian government. We got all the orders from a former High Court Judge McHugh, and there was massive damages, but the damages occurred because they inflicted that upon us. You don't get damages for free. Court's got to say, well, this is what you would have had or you're entitled to.
Have you seen the West Australian front pages where they portrayed you as a cockroach and a cane toad?
Cane toad and a chicken.
Dr. Evil.
Yeah, well, I wrote them a letter saying that it's good to see the WA newspaper becoming a comic book, right? I said, in that regard, they're an excellent comic book. They've got wonderful graphic artists. And their copywriters are fantastic, but where are their journalists gone?
Great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good, Peter. All the best.
Well, there he is, the inimitable Clive Palmer. No doubt he will play a crucial role in the upcoming Queensland election. He's certainly got long pockets, that's for sure.